Welcome to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. I just finished a conversation with Dr. Doris Iarovici, a psychiatrist at Harvard University Health Services, that gives us reason for cautious optimism about the college mental health crisis. I discovered Dr. Iarovici through her cover article in last month's Yale Alumni Magazine, where she brought attention to this critical issue. As a graduate of Yale College and Yale Medical School, who also has spent over 2 decades treating college students, as well as authoring a new book, Coping on Campus, Mental Health and the University Student. She brings both clinical expertise and deep compassion to this urgent conversation. While she shared concerning statistics, depression rates nearly doubling to 41% over the past decade, she also revealed that we're seeing the glimmers of potential improvements for the first time in years. Throughout this discussion, she provided a thoughtful analysis of the complex factors driving these trends, from snowplow parenting that removes obstacles from students' paths to the profound impact of social media on developing brains. She explained how different student populations experience these challenges, from variations between private and public universities to the patterns observed at historically Black colleges. We also explored promising solutions, including why in-person connection remains critical even in our digital world. If you're concerned about young people's mental health or simply interested in understanding this generation's unique challenges, you'll find her perspective both clear-eyed about the problems and hopeful about our path forward. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Dr. Iarovici, thank you very much for joining us today. Perhaps you could start by telling us about your background and what led you to focus on college student mental health.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me on the podcast and giving me the opportunity to talk about these important issues and questions. So I entered psychiatry interested in sort of adolescence, that period in life. And I thought for a long time I was going to be a child and adolescent psychiatrist. But during my general training, I did an elective at a college mental health center at Duke University and discovered that I loved working with that population and ultimately focused my career on it. So I ended up not doing the child and adolescent fellowship. These days, a lot of college campus psychiatrists do also have child and adolescent training, which I think is a nice complement to the work that we do, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And I would say that in the beginning of my work with college students, there were very few psychiatrists doing the work. So that's about 20, 25 years ago. The College Counseling Center had arisen in a developmental model where universities were really looking to help students with advising and counseling, which is very different than, what we traditionally thought of as clinical work. It's kind of more like helping with problems of living or problems of deciding on majors or the more typical kinds of problems that I think a lot of us either personally experienced or saw our friends go through during the 4 years at college, 4 or longer. As we know, sometimes it can take longer. But that's really changed over the last few decades so that now young adults, the 18 to 22-year-old population, but also we're seeing people in graduate school and professional school really experiencing unprecedented rates of both sort of normal developmental difficulties, but also psychiatric illness. And so the need for more clinical expertise has grown, and then also there are more psychiatrists in the field, I would say, over the course of my career. But I loved working with this population, I think in part because often we're seeing the first course or the first episode of a psychiatric illness, which with proper intervention can improve, can sometimes be completely taken care of. And then also I always think of it as we're at a turning point in people's lives where treatment makes such a huge difference. We know that mental health problems are probably the biggest reason that students don't complete college. So it's a really important issue for retention of students and completion. And we know that a college degree, despite what we're hearing now in the press, is still economically worth it for the great majority of people. Not for everybody. There's some data showing that for students who go into great debt financing college and then choose to do a field that doesn't promise them huge financial rewards, then it may not be financially a good investment. But, I would say that there are certainly rewards to being in college beyond just the financial. And probably rewards that are really important for our democracy in terms of an educated populace.
Yes, and you would think that part of what college is supposed to be doing is preparing you for life so that you can handle it better. And so it's a shame to lose anybody for reasons of not being able to feel like you can adjust to the world. Share with us some of the statistics, because the magnitude was alarming, but the sudden change has also become alarming. And
Yeah,
you being the best perspective on that, since you were probably at the front lines of seeing how this has all changed.
I think maybe the most sudden change came with the pandemic, where we saw a very abrupt worsening of a trend that we had really been seeing starting, I would say at the beginning of the millennium. So, already by 2000 and probably even a few years before, there are a number of national surveys of college students. One is the American Freshman National Norms Survey, which has been ongoing for, I think it's close to 50 years now. Out of, I believe it's UCLA, and now it's a national center that does that survey. And then there's another big survey called the Healthy Minds Survey, which is out of University of Michigan. So those surveys were capturing a trend where each year it seemed students were self-rating their emotional health a little bit worse. So it was really kind of creeping downward. And but in aggregate, when we look at like 10 or 20-year periods, the changes are very alarming. And then the worst came during the pandemic, which, as we know, worsened mental health across the board, but especially in, children and young adults, emerging adults. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that label, emerging adulthood, means. But I actually have some newer data. I think in my article, which, I had to write months before it was actually published, we had data from the year that ended in 2022. And at that point, we were seeing, if we're talking about trends from, maybe 10 years ago, we were seeing almost a doubling of depression and anxiety to rates around, 40% for depression and close to that for anxiety. But actually, the newer data from the 2023-24 data set, moderate or severe depression as self-reported by students came down to 38%. Now, that's still very high, but if we look at the year just before that, it was at 41%.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com.
And although that's not a huge change, it's the first time that we've seen a change. And actually, I think the year before that, it was still slightly even like a percentage point higher. So really what we're seeing like this, just this fall, is that for the first time in like 20 years, a couple of indices of mental health have improved very slightly, but we're all hoping maybe that's a trend. Similarly, if we look at the data for eating disorders, it was at 14% last year, and then this year it's at 13%. Again, not, it's still high and not a huge change. We could say, is that even statistically significant? But we haven't seen decreases at all. So we're all really excited about the decrease.
No,
Anxiety
14% on eating disorders, 14% is both male and female.
correct. Yep.
So,
These are aggregate.
and I assume that the statistics are still much smaller for men than they are for women.
They are much smaller, but they're growing.
We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation.xyz. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future.
And then
Yes.
the other thing that we're seeing is that, we see more and more students identify as non-binary or gender diverse or trans. And we also see a very high rate of eating disorder symptoms in that population. And I think the field, is trying to catch up with that because we're trying to understand what that is and how gender dysphoria differs from body dysmorphia, for example. So, the discomfort that someone may have with their body shape or size, how that is different in young adults who also feel uncomfortable in their gender identity. So, but if the numbers that I just gave you, though, if we look just a decade earlier, they're quite a bit lower. And it's in the Healthy Minds data, they were collecting they were asking the questions just a little bit different. So it's hard to compare exactly apples to apples. But if we look at, for example, severe depression, which in this most recent survey was at about 19%, a decade ago is at 12%. So that's a pretty significant rise in just 10 years. Eating disorders were at 9%. The most recent survey data coming out of 2023 is, quite alarming. But I guess I want to point out that different groups of students are affected differently. So the National Norm Survey asks the question, have you had any, psychological disorder? So it's a kind of broad question, and they give as examples depression or PTSD. And in 2023, close to 20% of students answered affirmatively. That's compared to only 13.9% if we look just back to 2018. So that's less than a decade ago, pre-pandemic. But if we look at certain populations, like specifically non-binary, students who identify as non-binary, gender diverse, trans, almost 60% of them identify as having had a psychological disorder. So that's really quite high. And the numbers are also different. The American norms, the American freshman study looks at different kinds of universities. And, I didn't kind of bring all that data with me, but I think it's important to note that the numbers differ based on whether people are in a four-year private university versus a four-year state school versus, for example, community college, so two-year associate degrees. And then also they break down the data for institutions such as the historically Black colleges and universities, and the data are different in those settings as well. They're actually, many of those numbers are lower in the historically Black colleges and universities. And, we're not really sure why that is, but it's interesting.
How about the difference between public and private universities?
So I would say the rates tend to be slightly higher in private universities actually than in public universities.
Fascinating. And what would be a hypothesis for that?
So a hypothesis has to do with stigma, right? So we're still not, we're not at a point where there is no stigma around having mental health difficulties. And so we think that, private universities tend to skew toward young people who have had maybe more resources or more availability of treatment or families who are more aware that there can be mental health challenges. And they're more likely to just kind of know and maybe feel less stigmatized in seeking help.
Does that imply that a lot could be explained by the higher diagnosis rate of it or an exaggerated diagnosis?
I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of debate in the field about that. So we do think some of it is that people are picking up diagnoses earlier. And, for example, we know that more children and adolescents are being diagnosed with depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, and other difficulties, and then getting treatment. And we know that treatment works, and it enables kids who might never have gone to college to get in and then matriculate at college. But we also know that the transition to college is a moment of great vulnerability for young people, because the system shifts to one that, in childhood, our parents are taking care of everything and advocating for services. And in college, that's not the case. So, we're expecting 18-year-olds to make that transition to managing their own health. And whether or not that you've had a difficulty before coming to college, I think that's a transition for everybody, learning how to take care of your own mental health. And I think it presents a great opportunity. Are we overdiagnosing? We probably are overdiagnosing somewhat because, especially now it's with certain diagnoses, and, I can come back to this, but my one that we've all seen, I think, in the field in the last probably 2 to 3 years is ADHD. We've just seen an explosion, and there's tons of national data that suggests that there's no way that as many people have ADHD as think they do, especially in the young adult cohort. We know that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that starts in childhood. So it doesn't just start in college or graduate school or, but people are struggling, right? They're having very real crises of attention. And, most of us have experienced that. I know that I have. And we think there are many reasons for that, but at the same time, there are TikTok videos, there are all kinds of sort of self-diagnosis tutorials online that are teaching young people how to come into a doctor's office and present symptoms. And, because we don't have a blood test for ADHD, we kind of only go with what the person is presenting us. And, in some small percentage, I think probably it is somebody who perhaps the diagnosis was missed in childhood, but for many of them, they're struggling with something else. I mean, something real is going on. They are having difficulties, but it's probably not ADHD. And, that's just one example. So, there is some overdiagnosis. And at the same time, I think there's also underdiagnosis because, again, the fact that we see differences between public and private universities or the historically Black colleges and universities and other institutions suggests that there are also, we know that from all the epidemiological studies, depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders don't discriminate, right? So everybody has similar risks of having these issues, but not everyone gets treatment. Not everyone comes in for treatment or even, recognizes that they're having these issues. So I think it's both over and under diagnosis.
Well, I suppose, yeah, for the ADHD, there are a lot of benefits that accrue to those who are diagnosed with it, longer test times and ability to take medication that does increase your focus and improve your
Right.
productivity.
Right, right. It's interesting, the studies that have been done on, because the question is, so if you're diagnosed with ADHD, does taking a stimulant improve your performance? And there's some evidence that actually it does not. It does improve
Interesting.
focus, it improves concentration. So any of us, if we took a stimulant, would experience those changes, not just people with ADHD. But if someone is accurately diagnosed with ADHD, it does, it makes a huge change in their life. And so that's the part that's really difficult from a diagnostic perspective. We don't want to miss the people who genuinely have ADHD because, ADHD leads to a lot of negative consequences, not just
Yep.
underperformance in school, but also, higher rate of accidents. We think that there's probably a slightly higher mortality risk due to accidents. Divorce rates are higher. People have difficulty in interpersonal relationships. So it's really like a global, a condition that affects many different aspects of a person's life. What we tend to see in, academic populations are people who are struggling academically, and they believe that that's ADHD. Often they're overcommitted. We see that a lot at selective colleges, right? So people might be in, 3, 4 extracurriculars, and they're doing a very demanding academic caseload, and they're sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, and they are genuinely struggling, but it's probably because of all those other factors.
Well, it is interesting because when I was in college, there weren't very many people that were taking excess workload. I didn't know anybody. And today it's much more prevalent. And by the same token, I didn't notice that mental health was an issue to even be addressed because wherever it may have happened, it was quickly taken care of. The student would leave or whatever, and it just seemed very rare. So there was probably a dramatic underreporting of problems, unless these problems have actually been getting a lot worse. And in those days, it may have been underreporting, but there wasn't a lot of it anyway. Do you have a feel for that when you go back a generation, 2 generations, what the prevalence was of mental challenges?
So again, the studies we have, there were many fewer studies with this, with particularly the college population. So now we have many more studies. So we may have, well, we'll have a better understanding going forward, but how do we kind of look at what came before? The numbers were lower. The American Freshman National Norms Survey was showing lower numbers like 30, 40 years ago for sure.
Of self-reporting challenges.
Self-reported distress, right? So, then the question is, was the distress lower? Was the reporting lower? Hard to say. I think that we didn't think of this transition as a particularly difficult one. And I do think there are cultural factors that have changed that make it more difficult for more emerging adults. And if we talk for a minute about just the concept of emerging adulthood, which was new in 2000, basically, is when that term kind of came into certainly mental health consciousness. But it was a psychologist named Jeffrey Barnett who did studies noticing this trend toward more mental health difficulties, but also that it coincided with the delay of the traditional milestones of adulthood. So, traditionally things like marriage, first jobs, birth of, first child, were happening later and later in sort of post-industrial countries. And along with that, he found that what were traditionally considered the psychological milestones of adolescence. So, certainly like what in my generation, what we grew up with, like that during like the 13 to 18-year-old period, kids were doing things like, defying their parents and staying out late and maybe experimenting with drinking or drugs or driving too fast. That all that had shifted and was actually now happening during the college years. And, we've seen that trend continue. The really fascinating thing for me is when I first read his initial, like his seminal paper, he was saying that emerging adulthood constituted a new developmental phase that went from 18 to 24. And then maybe like 5 years later, he changed that estimate. He said, actually, it's like 18 to 29. And those of us in the field started to joke and say, well, he's going to keep moving the upper limit. And,
Upper
eventually
bracket inflation.
40, right? Yeah. But it's a real thing, so for those of us who work with young adults, we see this and, and I've seen it raising my own kids and, so I think these are real like cultural forces that we can't ignore. And they're not just in the United States, because some people say, well, is it the United States or is it the Western world? But now there's a whole body of literature on emerging adulthood that shows that it's actually across the globe. So we're seeing it certainly across Western Europe and, Asia and some countries in Africa, Australia. We're just seeing it all over the globe. So it's not limited to nations like the US.
That sounds so amazing. I wonder, because I don't know what it would be that in the post-industrial world that has changed dramatically enough in this short period of time that would cause such a coincident increase in mental health. A lot of it is awareness. So I think mental health awareness has to be a big factor because the stigma was lost at some point in the past between when I was in college and later. But it's hard to imagine that stigma would account for all of it.
Right. And actually, if you look at data out of Asia, so, just in kind of thinking about our discussion, and you had mentioned, other parts of the world. So I actually looked at sort of the most recent data. And again, I'm not an expert on mental health in other parts of the world, but I know I've read some of the literature and I know it a little bit. But I came across a study that was done recently in the ASEAN countries, so looking at sort of Southeast Asia. And it was a study of mental health among college students, and they found remarkably similar rates when they ask students to kind of self-report whether they've had mental health difficulties. Really remarkably similar. Like actually, the one that surprised me was like the rate of eating disorders was 13.9%. And you might recall that was exactly where we saw it in the Healthy Minds data out of the US. And their study was a meta-analysis, so it was looking at many studies across those countries. So remarkably similar rates. What was really different in those countries was rate of treatment. So, and and access to services. So, um, they're way under treating. So it's not just like what's being picked up. It seems to be pretty firmly, and also stigma is quite high in those countries. So mental health issues are still way more stigmatized than they are in the US or maybe, parts of Western Europe. And yet the rates of self-report when people have the opportunity to self-report on a survey are similar. So I don't think it's certainly stigma plays a part, but I don't think it's the only explanation. I think we are seeing cultural forces. People say, well, what about World War II? Or there were times that the world was, there were very bleak world events that were also happening. I think that there's so many cultural forces that have come together to create this sense among young adults of, hopelessness or pessimism, to use your term. If we look at the US, there is, first it's that delay of traditional milestones, right? So the sense that you have to invest so much in your educational years, and that feeling starts very early, right? So we've seen kind of a loss of childhood, like childhood play. We see that parents are very over worried about their children's safety. Um, we can talk a little bit about that, but we helicopter parenting was a thing that was in the sort of national consciousness a decade or two ago. Now people in education are talking about snowplow parenting, which is this idea that parents can not just kind of keep an eye on their kids and maybe micromanage, but that they can actually take a role in removing obstacles from their child's path. So, and again, we're not talking about young children, which is what the role of parents is, to take care of and remove obstacles. We're talking about young adults. So, by the time kids are 18 to 22, they need to be learning those skills to do it themselves. Otherwise, they're going to hit some rough patches in the years ahead. And again, this isn't all parents, right? We're talking about maybe parents with resources, not just financial resources, but time, right? So it takes a lot of time to manage your young adult's child's life. But we also see, again, in the US, we've seen kind of concentration of wealth in certain groups. I think, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I do see it play out on the college campus, and that young adults are way more worried about finances. We know that the cost of a college education has skyrocketed way out of proportion with other economic indicators. So that proportionately a college degree now costs much more than it did when I went to college. And we're talking not just at the private universities, but public as well. So
And you wrote about some degree of guilt among some of the college students.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I've heard that, not uncommonly, that students feel like they have to be a good return on investment, using that language that comes out of like the economic world or corporate world, but applying it to themselves as human beings. And I think that's really erosive, right?
I wasn't aware of that very much at all when I was in college.
Right, right. And I mean, I took out loans in college, so I was not someone who could afford to pay for I went to private college, and it was my first exposure to private college. I had gone to public school the whole way until college. But I got grants, I got loans, and the loans were not onerous. There were still federal grants at the time, which no longer exist. I think a lot of the federal loan programs have changed. I believe it was sometime around during the Reagan era that a lot of funding for higher ed was cut. And so a lot of the wealthier and more selective colleges and universities have increased aid, right? So that there are now programs that if your family makes below a certain amount, you might get a free ride to a place like an Ivy League college. But again, that doesn't cover a lot of families who are trying to send their kids to college. And honestly, there's still despite colleges kind of recruiting and being out there in a variety of communities, in my experience, like especially as I've interviewed kids for college and as volunteer work, I see that a lot of students don't know that, don't know which schools have need-blind admissions, don't know that if they are able to get into certain institutions, they won't have to pay for it. So there's a lot of worry about the financial piece. And we know all the data shows that financial stress correlates with, depression and anxiety. And
Well, we haven't mentioned the one that everybody talks about, and that's the social media impact. You did
yes,
write about that. We probably ought to address that.
absolutely. Yes. So, there's controversy too in the data about whether so we know that it's irrefutable that um, higher amounts of social media engagement correlate with more depression and anxiety in young people. There's a lot of controversy over whether it's cause or effect, right? So the question is it that people who spend too much time online end up more depressed and anxious, or is it that people who are already depressed and anxious turn to the internet? And, it's hard to tease that apart. There's probably some of both going on, but I can tell you, I personally have no doubt that it is contributing from my read of the data and my experience of working with young adults. There's some really good studies now being done in children and adolescents. There was one that was published in JAMA Pediatrics that looked at sleep and social media use and found that kids, I think it was middle schoolers who were online more, slept less, and then also seemed to have more depressive and anxiety symptoms. And that paper suggested that maybe sleep is the mediating factor. So, something that takes you out of all kinds of normal rhythms is going to interrupt other processes that are necessary for good mental health. Um, I just read something in the paper like yesterday. I'll mention one other paper, which I thought was fascinating, which looked at functional MRI imaging, so actual, pictures of the brain in middle schoolers, and it looked at their use of social media and changes in the brain. And the middle schoolers who were on social media for more hours had changes in areas of the brain that are directly responsible for things like emotional regulation and impulse control. So again, this is, to me, that's very alarming in terms of development. Um, I read, a couple of days ago, there was a editorial about, well, people have been hand-wringing about novel technologies since the dawn of time. People thought the novel was going to kill interpersonal relationships. There's a very funny headline I saw that said, like, this new discovery, everyone said it's going to stop in-person conversation and make everyone retreat to their own corners. And apparently
This was the writing of novels in the.
well, the writing of novels, but the other one I read about was that it was actually like the wood stove. People were extremely worried that the wood stove was going to interfere with the hearth, which was a way that people were coming together. So, people are saying social media and digital devices are no different than any other technological advance. And I think that's not true, right? So I also did some research in neuroscience before I went to medical school and then during medical school as well. So again, I'm not a neuroscientist, but um, I know something of that world, and I try to read some of the neuroscience literature now as well. And we know that the companies that are developing new digital technologies, and in particular social media, which, let's face it, it doesn't really exist to connect us. It exists to sell us products and kind of keep our economy going, which, that's something we all accept in order to stay connected in some ways. But they are using the tools of neuroscience to keep us engaged. So, it's a technology that's actually using our own hardwired brain processes to keep us engaged with something that's not necessarily, I mean, that there are ulterior motives for. So I think that's different. And
That is different. And I remember when television was moving from 2 hours a day for children consumption to whatever it got to, it seemed like it was 7 or 8 hours a day.
right.
That there are similarities in social media in the amount of time that people are spending. But what big difference is that the social media companies do have these techniques of making sure that what is delivered to you is something that they have a statistical advantage in knowing you want to see.
Right. That's
And
right.
television didn't really have that. It was a passive interaction, and you had the decision on which channel you were going to watch and things like that. But it does address the part of social interaction. Um, and when I was a child, just an inordinately high amount of my time was just wandering around the neighborhood, playing with neighbors, building dams and streams and doing all sorts of things that really are not happen. And when I played sports, it was largely ad hoc. It wasn't organized. It was five of us getting together to figure out a game to play, and it was, around a whatever kind of sport it would be, with whatever kind of a ball it would be. And in your article, you mentioned that Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, I guess he was class of '03 from Yale, launched a We Are Made to Connect tour based on one of the most astonishing statistics that I saw, which was students, I guess it's self-reporting, felt lonelier than people over 65 by double. And
Yes.
that just, I mean, during those years of college, that was the social time. And so it's very surprising. And I think that may be one of the biggest shocks as I read your article, from when my memory of college. And is this something that could keep getting worse? Are all of these statistics things that people worry might even continue to get worse? Or should we see a correction? Are we able to address this? Are we able to try and fix this? Are universities and student groups or whatever it would be, are there efforts that actually can reverse this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are seeing some corrections, right? So some of this is still residual damage from the COVID pandemic. And again, we have to remember that this was sort of a worldwide, severely frightening and dangerous moment, right? Where we had a novel virus that was threatening people's lives, and we saw a disproportionate number of deaths. So,
Yeah, it's, a lot of people forget how in the beginning of COVID, people were dying. There was no way to know who w was going
right,
to, how you were going to get it, or if you were going to get it, or whether you had it. It was an
right,
extremely frightening time, and it definitely had residual impact.
right. And I would guess that there have been other times like that. The influenza epidemic in the whenever it was the 1920s, and so, but we just don't. We didn't have electronic media that kept us all connected to what was going on all over the world then. So I do think some of it is probably residual, but the residual is going to be with us for a while because there were so many children affected by the loss of school during those years. I think, will it continue to get worse? I think that depends on how we react now and what we do, right? So we are still seeing again, and I don't want to imply that all technology is bad. I think technology is also wonderful. You and I are meeting over Zoom. I think that the possibility to pivot to an online platform that allowed us, for example, to continue providing mental health services during lockdown was amazing. I had not, seen anything like that in my lifetime, and it was a time when people really needed us. And I continued, I worked my regular hours during the pandemic from home, and students were incredibly grateful for that. And so, we have technologies that really do help us, but we have to figure out how to use those technologies so they serve our purposes rather than the other way around. So as an example, the We Are Made to Connect tour, which was a college campus initiative, kind of reminding students that you need to connect in person. Was a really powerful message that I think we have to figure out how to deliver in other ways too, right? So I think social media can perhaps supplement in-person gatherings and in-person connection. If they take over, then I think we start to see mental health problems. Um, so what we're seeing now with, I was just reading this week about the absenteeism among children in elementary and middle school remains high, much higher than pre-pandemic levels. We see that, again, I don't know all the statistics, but we see that on college campuses, it's improving. So we've seen a gradual improvement over the last few years, but kids who've grown up, like, not necessarily going in person to school, like they don't really understand why they have to go now. I understand that companies are struggling with that too, like how much of their workforce should be in person, how much is it okay to do remotely? But these are important questions, and I don't have all the answers, but I think we have to figure out what amount of time is sort of the minimum for people to be healthy human beings, sort of the minimum, and then maybe not aim for the minimum amount of time together. But we're not going to, the digital technologies cannot supplant in-person connection. And I think that there are probably strong biological reasons for that. We're mammals. We kind of, something happens when we're physically in a room with someone that, won't happen in the same way over technology. I do also want to say that there is some data that certain populations are affected differently by social media use. One really interesting statistic that I came across was that actually so the number of hours online in college students correlates with higher ratings of depression and anxiety in the students themselves. Again, not entirely sure what's cause and effect, but it's like you can look at bar graphs and it looks like a step ladder. In increments of like 2 to 3 hours more per week, levels of depression and anxiety rise, with the exception of if you look at the trans and non-binary group, and there it's actually the opposite. It's an inverse correlation. So it looks like for those students, spending more time online actually decreases depression and anxiety. And again, don't know exactly why, but the theory is that they are finding like-minded communities and feeling supported and affirmed. And so, we believe that if there was that support and affirmation in their in-person interactions, or maybe more of it, that there would be less of a need to try to find it online. But, so that's one example. There may be other communities too, where, people are finding support for, we know that in certain kinds of like rare diseases where people might have trouble finding other people in their immediate community, and we know that support is important as people are going through treatment, finding communities online can be really beneficial.
One of the things that you did not mention, and maybe it's outside of your purview, but I've been hearing increasing reports that nutrition and the microbiome can impact a lot more of a person's life, including psychological and mental health areas. Are there studies on that? And how do you think, because that does seem to have changed over the last generation or two, the quality of food in the country?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but I have also been hearing that. And I know that there are people in psychiatry actively working on that. And it does look like, that's going to be an important factor as well. I think that, again, as an eating disorder specialist, I worry that people misinterpret that data. And we've also seen people become very rigid with what they eat. So again, these are decisions that are sometimes, what our food supply is like. That's something that we don't have that much control over as individuals. So I think when we hear about that, it's not necessarily the individual choices we make, but rather like how our food supply is kind of overseen and regulated or not regulated. There's really interesting data, like with, we've seen an explosion in people who have difficulties with gluten, not necessarily celiac disease, which we know is like something that will make you really sick if you have gluten. But a lot of people who have what they believe is gluten sensitivity, and we test for it and we don't really see it in the available blood tests. But there's more and more data that, if, for example, if you look at the foods, the gluten product supply in countries like France, it is different. And, again, this is more anecdotal, but people with gluten sensitivity or even celiac report that they can eat bread in other countries and not get as sick as they do in the US. So there's something going on. I'm not sure what it is.
I've seen studies, particularly on gluten, about that as well.
And I'm sure, of course, it affects mental health too.
Mm-hmm.
You're not feeling physically well. We know there's a strong brain-gut connection. more serotonin receptors in the gut than the brain.
I'm awfully curious about cohorts. And if we look at the cohorts, you probably from your early days, if you have any follow-up with any of your patients from years and years ago, whether as a group they tend to get healthier over time or not. And particularly with this spike in problems around COVID, just prior and just after. If we go out 20, 30, 40 years when these people are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, do we anticipate that they've adjusted to life as a group better or not? Is there any supporting data for this? What should we be thinking about down the road?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. The data strongly suggests that treatment works, that treatment helps, and this is just across populations. So, my hope is certainly with treatment and attention to the problems, this cohort will feel better and rates of depression and anxiety will go down. Some studies, just even in student groups, suggest that like students over 30 report better mental health than students under 30. So that's hopeful that, as maybe this is a particular period of vulnerability and then, kind of making it through and getting support helps people get to the other side. And when I say treatment, I also want to make sure I'm making the point that I think we need a public health perspective in tackling these problems. So it's not just treatment like having to see a mental health professional, although that's very important in some cases, but also creating communities where there's support and a sense of belonging. We know that that really promotes mental health. And then also appropriate challenges, right? So again, not removing all challenges, but making sure that young adults have the opportunity to tackle on their own challenges that are developmentally appropriate to them. So, again, I want to make sure that I'm making the point that we're not asking families or institutions to say, I'm going to step back and let terrible things happen to my kid or my student, because, in times of severe stress or, if there's abuse or anything that approaches that, people need help to get through that. So, or if it's a challenge that they're just not prepared for, we need to give people the skills to get through the challenge. But the idea that we can remove difficulty or remove challenge is probably not benefiting anyone. And we see that in the classroom as well. We now see kind of this backlash against, the idea of trigger warnings. But again, we want to be thoughtful about how we prepare young adults to, encounter difficulty and difficult conversations and difference of opinion. But I do think that there are ways to do that we need to, I don't know that I have all the answers to that. I would say I don't for sure. But I think that
I was hoping you did.
I mean, there's so many people who could be working on this, and I think again, it's going to take working interdisciplinarily. So maybe mental health professionals and higher ed folks, and
It feels like this is a much more popular field of study and that the profession is growing quite rapidly. Mental health help.
yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true.
There's another maybe secret source of hope about all this, and that is over time, I suppose we could call it a cyclicality to parenting practices and a socialization. And so, helicopter parenting perhaps might morphing into snowplow parenting. Maybe there will be some relaxation of this intrusion into children's upbringing. Do we see anything on that front?
I haven't seen studies to that effect, unfortunately, but I do think that, maybe having parents be more aware of the risks of overparenting and allowing some degree of freedom to their kids. I mean, you talked about being like, pick up baseball games or pick up sports and being able to wander. Some people have called that free range childhood now, like this idea that
Like chickens.
like chickens. But how do you allow children to have a little bit more freedom and flexibility? And, I mean, I think that it's hard to convince parents that there isn't so much riding on their kids getting into particular colleges, or, so maybe having more of an understanding that good lives happen in all kinds of different ways, and that there isn't like one path to success or happiness. Um, and that maybe happiness isn't always like that's a very amorphous goal, so what does it mean to live a good life? Like maybe having more discussions about that too, to ease that fear that I think parents have, and then it sometimes translates into putting a lot of pressure on children.
I
And
would throw safety into that category, into that
yes,
mix as well. There's definitely we rode bikes everywhere as a
right,
kid, and there are no bikes anymore because parents are so worried, and you have to,
right,
the cars might hit the bikes. Yeah, they might, but they generally don't. And
right, right. And to
and
your
that's just one
point,
example.
I mean, to your point earlier about like, the reality is some things are much more safe now than they were. There's something that's happening where there's a bias, I think, in the information we're getting that implies more danger sometimes than there is. I mean, I think, we're better informed about the various dangers, but we're also sometimes over-informed. And I think, we may hear about things happening in other parts of the world or other parts of our own state or city that actually don't necessarily apply to us, but I think we misinterpret the information we get. So again, like making sure people are educated in how to understand statistics and how to understand information that we're getting. And maybe a little less exposure, frankly, to to news. We know that also just the constant exposure, that's another thing that we didn't used to have, like the 24/7 news cycle. Um, there was news on maybe for an hour, and you pick up the paper and that was, you put it down. But now it's like it's constant.
I think there's another angle of that, and that's just the number of news stories that were available there. Going back far enough, there were three networks. They had half an hour every night, really half an hour. And so you could get six or seven, maybe 10 stories. That was it. So you didn't know most of the rest of the world. And now the number of stories is really infinite.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So are there more reasons to be optimistic looking out 20 years for college student mental health than there are reasons to be pessimistic?
I mean, I like to hope so. I've certainly seen, you asked about, unfortunately, I don't have data on like my own patients, but I've certainly heard from patients over the years, who have had good outcomes and occasionally will write me a letter or email or, um, kind of accrediting their own treatment with where they are now. So we certainly see that. Again, that's not a study, right? It would be nice
No,
to
it's a self-selection bias a bit,
self-selection
but
bias.
still, I mean, and you would expect to see a very, healthy percent of those people doing
Yeah,
either better on their own through life experiences or
right.
doing better because of treatment.
Yeah. And I guess what I would say, I think it's hopeful that people are understanding more, and again, I've worked at selective sort of elite colleges, and I can tell you that over the years, I see, if we look at, for example, the alumni magazine and who they feature, or they might have a story of, a very successful alum on the cover, or a story about a student who's going on to do like a Rhodes Scholarship, and not infrequently, some of those people are people I've worked with clinically. And so I often tell other students, not, of course, not identifying anyone, but just saying like, it's not an either or. Like some highly successful people also struggle with mental health issues. And the issue isn't having the mental health problem. The issue is what you do once you have it. And, we're all human. So it's actually part of being human. I think that a positive trend is that we're better understanding now that it's not that some people are mentally ill and some people aren't. It's that we're all human. At certain moments in our life, we have illnesses. Sometimes those illnesses manifest as, cough or pneumonia, or, for some people, it might be like cancer or heart disease. And sometimes it's depression, and sometimes it's anxiety, and, sometimes things like schizophrenia. But then the question is, how do you handle that? And you try to do the best in terms of addressing whatever the issue is, so that you can kind of continue to enjoy your life. So I think the more that we see mental health issues as just part of our health and being human, um, I think that's a positive outlook that we can, they're treatable, they're, you know, manageable when they're not treatable. I've had, again, the numbers are really small, but I've treated people with schizophrenia who end up as students at places like Duke or Harvard. And I think most people would be shocked at that. I was surprised myself in the beginning. It's kind of like, well, schizophrenia is such a devastating illness that someone who has that kind of diagnosis would have a hard time going to especially a selective college or university. But people do, and they make it through, and they have other challenges when they have that particular diagnosis, but they make it through. So
One of the things, having lived life, is it's so um, sad when somebody is only 15, 16, 18, 20, 22 years old, and they feel depressed and destitute because life hasn't gone the right way, when life is beautiful. Give it a chance and things can go
yeah,
right just as much as they can go wrong. And it's kind of setting up the boundaries for what is good news and bad news and how do we handle it. And okay, that was a setback. I have a story of a friend who was just down and out for a long time, and he burst out laughing driving his car one day, realizing it can't get any worse than this. And his life turned around on a dime. And the next 20 years were amazingly successful beyond his wildest dreams.
wow.
And it's life is long. There's a lot of changes that always happen.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Doris, thank you so much. It was so great to connect and hear about all this. It's such a major focus, or it should be a major focus, and it is a potential problem. And you've offered us some hope.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity. And yeah, let me know if you have other questions, or it's been great talking to you.
Great talking to you too. Thank you very much. If you like this video, please hit like, subscribe, and leave any comments you might have. You might also want to check out some of my other interviews. We try to dig into the problems that make Americans so pessimistic about the next generation, but we also interview people whose work doesn't get the headlines, but they make life better for society every day. Given humanity's steady progress over the last 275 years, it's likely that there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspectives on today's challenges and opportunities.